Well, I think it is a question about my family, because my brother-in-law was a physician. He was a cardiologist, and I felt interest in the field of medicine, not particular cardiology, but medicine. So therefore, I thought this would be very interesting.
Coffee.
And I can continue.
Or start again, as you want.
Well, and then this was one point. My family, my brother-in-law, although there are no physicians in my real family, so I was the first physician and even the first academician in my family. But then there was, in the city where I lived, there was also a very famous, I would say, although he may not be known so well today, Professor Lundbeck. I think he was to me what Richiero was to you. He was my mentor, so to say, and he was a general diabetologist who was interested in complications, diabetic complications. That was his issue, and he made epidemiology studies that became quite famous at that time, but now I think he's forgotten. So we must all realize that we are forgotten in a few years. But this was also a reason, because then I approached him to do some studies. And interesting enough, I could say that a circle is now finished to some extent, because the first study I did when I started to work with Lundbeck was with dextran clearance. And the first presentation I made was here in Prague. And this was 43 years ago in September. And I told you that was while the Russian tanks were outside the city. But in the city it was quite peaceful, very nice city, beautiful restaurants, and you did not really sense the pressure of the Russians. So in a way the Czechs, the Prague people continued to live. But of course they were suppressed all the time during the communist era. But this was interesting, and it's very nice to come back again. But I must say that my first project with dextran clearance was a failure. In a way it was a failure, because it was very interesting from a theoretical point of view. You had a molecule with a wide molecular range, and it was neither secreted nor reabsorbed by the tubules, like, for instance, the proteins, many plasma proteins. And therefore, it was believed that making clearances of that molecule would be very interesting, because you could really get rid of the reabsorption of the plasma proteins, etc., and you could get a precise measurement of what we call the glomerular permeability profile. So this was very exciting, but in practice it did not work because it was impossible to detect any abnormalities in short-term diabetes, and even not in long-term diabetes, where you have profound proteinuria. So this was very disappointing. But then it led to some other development. Of course, when you have a failure, you would try to change it into a success, of course. And to measure dextran clearance, you had to refer to glomerular filtration rate. And at that time, it was not really believed to be correct to use creatinine clearance, because creatinine is also reabsorbed or secreted by the tubules. So creatinine was not so interesting, and therefore I turned to the pioneer of nephrology, not in Europe, but in America, and this was of course Homer Smith. Homer Smith was really the great man in kidney physiology and in nephrology in America, and he used he used or proposed inulin clearance for measurement of glomerular filtration rate, and also the constant infusion technique, which was a little cumbersome, but we felt that this was the only measure that gave exact values of GFR. And to have an idea of the relevance of dextran, you had to have a referral to glomerular filtration rate. So therefore it was so interesting, you could say that it was a failure with dextran, but then it led me to the idea of looking after glomerular filtration rate. And then it appeared, and that was quite surprising, and not really very well known, and maybe not accepted, and people did not believe it, because in diabetic patients usually you have hyperfiltration. Diabetic patients usually have maybe a 20 to 40% increase in GFR. And people thought this was crazy because these patients often die from renal disease, so why should they have hyperfiltration initially? But this was the case, and in fact, if you go back in the history of medicine, it was in fact also found in the 50s in Italy and also in Switzerland. Many studies that showed that you had hyperfiltration in early diabetes. So this was quite interesting. And if we come back to Prague, for measuring inulin, I used a chemical procedure that was developed by Herowski, and he was a Czech person. So this is another reversal to Czech. He was at the Karl University, the Charles University here in Prague. So this was a method of Herowski. That was very interesting, and that we used for a long time. We had I did a lot of measurement of glomerular filtration rate in diabetic patients, and they practically all have hyperfiltration. And so the question came up, first of all, why do they have hyperfiltration? What is the background for that? And then I started to do studies in newly diagnosed patients who came into the hospital with newly diagnosed type 1 diabetes. And they had immense hyperfiltration. They may have a GFR of 170 or 80 if they were poorly controlled as they were, because they were never treated. But then it became clear when you treated these patients, the GFR was normalized. Not very quickly, it took some months. But anyway, so we could state that it is related to poor glycemic control. And at that time, and maybe even now, many diabetic patients do not have perfect control. Maybe they have in Paris or France, but not so much in Denmark actually. Although it has been improving a lot in the last years, of course. So one point was it was related to poor glycemic control. But still, an ordinary diabetic person would have poor control. The GFR was increased by maybe 20%. So he would or she would have a GFR of 140 or 150, and as you know, and as shown by Homer Smith and many other people, the normal GFR is 120. It's maybe a little higher now because people eat more protein now. And this was, of course, interesting, but it was even more interesting. Can I just continue? When time went on, and I continued to do these studies, and it appeared that you can have a patient without renal complications, that is without proteinuria and diabetes duration for 25 years, still hyperfiltration. But the question then, of course, came, these patients often end up in end-stage renal disease. So therefore, you could say that at a certain point, they would try to fall in GFR. And this was also a crucial point, because then I started to measure the decline rate in GFR in patients with light to severe proteinuria. So I could describe the rate of decline in GFR. And it went down in a very linear fashion related to blood pressure. So this was an important observation. If you have high blood pressure, and many people at that time had poorly regulated blood pressure, if the blood pressure was high, there was a rapid decline in glomerular filtration rate. So, and of course this was very logical to use this observation as a therapeutical measure. You should lower the blood pressure in these patients. And then maybe you remember, because this was in the 70s, and at that time the dogma was, don't treat blood pressure in these patients, because it just means that you have a more rapid decline in GFR. And this was because when you started to treat these patients, you had an increase in serum creatinine. And therefore people were very much afraid we should not treat these patients, because it means that the GFR would deteriorate more quickly. And it was believed that you had to have a certain perfusion pressure in the kidney to maintain normal renal function. And if you reduce blood pressure, this would be deteriorated. So all people said, don't treat these patients. Don't treat these, this is very dangerous. But I had this observation with the linear correlation between forward and GFR and blood pressure. This was very amazing, a linear correlation that I could establish by following the patients. And the idea for doing this study was that they came from a high GFR, but they ended up in a low GFR, so you must follow the patient while they have a decline in GFR. So therefore, I started to treat these patients, and at that time, the renal angiotensin system was not invented. So what should we use? Diuretics and beta blockers. So that was what I used, and it appeared to be quite successful. So several times I also went to Paris to give a talk at the Journée de Diabétologie de Haute-Dieu and report my results on hyperfiltration, on decline in GFR. And I have still kept these old books in French, which is quite nice to look at. And it took some time before it was really accepted that you should treat these patients. And then over the years, of course, it became clear to everybody that you should treat these patients. It was a gradual process, and suddenly they would say, you're an idiot if you don't treat these patients. And some years earlier you would say, you're an idiot if you treat these patients. So this is what I call a paradigm shift. So this was really a nice paradigm shift. So I tried to collect paradigm shifts, you see. And then, while doing follow-up of these patients with hyperfiltration, I followed the patient for many years, and then it appeared that these patients with the most severe hyperfiltration ended up in advanced renal disease. So this meant that hyperfiltration was a risk factor for later disease. And this was also, you could say, a paradigm shift. And this was an idea that was really established in the medical literature by Barry Brenner. But Barry Brenner was a rat doctor, but I am a human doctor. So he did a lot of studies in diabetic rats, and believe it or not, he told me that he did the micropuncture in these rats with diabetes. And this was not too difficult to do, because these rats with diabetes had huge glomeruli. So they had the glomerular hypertrophy, like they also have renal hypertrophy. And also in human diabetes, we found that patients with diabetes and poor control have renal hypertrophy. And that's why it's so easy to make a renal biopsy in diabetic patients, because they have big kidneys. So, and maybe you also know that the person who introduced renal biopsies was a Dane, Klaus Boom. So you don't have him as a list on the, because he's dead, of course. And he told me that at that time it was quite common to do liver biopsies. That was done more or less routinely. But then on a certain day when he did a liver biopsy, he saw kidney tissue in the specimen. So this was why he introduced the kidney biopsy. And I think he became famous for that. And now kidney biopsies is really routine in nephrology. Maybe it's now the radiologists who do the biopsies. Maybe it's now the radiologists who do biopsies, because they have the ultrasound, it's more safe. But then interesting, you saw that this hyperfiltration, the hyperfiltration is the route to decline in GFR. And so this was also kind of a paradigm shift. If you have a high GFR, you should believe that you were safe, but certainly not. It believes that you are at risk. But it's also clear that you have to have a certain degree of hyperfiltration to be at risk. And this, of course, was widely accepted also when Barrett Brenner did his studies, because he found that hyperfiltration was associated with increased pressure into the glomeruli. So this means that if you have hyperfiltration, you have increased pressure, and you have pressure-induced damage. So now it's quite logical that you have damage because you have high pressure, and this leads to damage in the kidney and leads to decline in GFR. Very simple now when you know it, but it's also a paradigm shift. Maybe. And is it okay? But now maybe we have the most interesting part of the story left. Because when I did these dextran clearances, it appeared that this was not useful at all. It was a very sophisticated technique. It took a long time, and you had to use symphatic separation, but there was no results. But at that time, it was when Hales and Randall in England, they developed the insulin assay, and this was a great advantage. They had the radioimmun assay for insulin. So this became very widespread for insulin, for hormones like growth hormone and many other hormones. But then also one of my mentors, Harry Keane in London, went to a diabetes meeting where he heard Hales and Randall measuring insulin by radioimmun assay, and he said to himself, why not measure albumin by radioimmun assay? So he developed the first assay to measure albumin in very small concentration, and it was not too difficult. You had to dilute the urine even in normal people, but it was not a difficult assay. And we developed a similar assay in our institution in parallel with the dextran clearance. And then dextran clearance was abandoned, and we looked at albumin excretion. And we defined, of course, the excretion in normal people is about 5 micrograms per minute, maybe going up to 12 or 15. And this was also found in many diabetic individuals, but some had higher values. And this was what Harry Keane called microalbuminuria. And some people say this is a misnomer because the American says that this is microalbuminuria is because they have a small molecule that is called microalbumin that is excreted in the urine. Of course, this is a misunderstanding, but still, the wording microalbuminuria is not quite logical. But when such a word has been introduced and accepted, you can't change it. So therefore, we continue to call it microalbuminuria, although many people propose new terms, but they never succeeded. They never succeeded. So microalbuminuria was also interesting because we also introduced normal albuminuria, patient at low risk, micro at higher risk, and macro at even higher risk. And microalbuminuria we determined as an excretion rate between 20 and 200 micrograms per minute. And I'm sure you know now when you have to define such a thing now, you have to have a committee, you have to have all the nephrologists, all the diabetologists gathered together, and they should discuss it. But this definition was defined by 10 diabetologists in Montecatini in Italy. And so it still works. Nobody tried to change it really seriously. So we were 10 people who decided this level, and this has continued to be accepted. So this is, I think, remarkable that you could do that without a big committee. If you had to do it today, you would have to have a very big committee, and some would argue against, some pro, etc. But not. We had this, and we published that first in an obscure journal, and then I published it in Kidney International, and then it became accepted. Everybody, in all the diabetes associations, etc., and it has continued to be accepted. So we had defined microalbuminuria, and we also found out that microalbuminuria was a very strong predictor of overt renal disease. This is maybe not surprising, but even a slight increase in albumin excretion rate predicts overt renal disease. So this we established in several studies, and also in type 2 diabetes. So the first in type 1, then in type 2, and then it was confirmed by many people that microalbuminuria predict renal disease, and it predicted also early mortality. If you have microalbuminuria, you are supposed to die early unless you are very efficiently treated. And So of course this led to the idea of intervention. You should treat these individuals, and then there's another paradigm shift, because I suggested that you should treat patients with microalbuminuria if they had type 1 diabetes, even if they had so-called normal blood pressure. Because what is a normal blood pressure? The old definitions you may remember many years ago was 160 over 95 or something like that. So we proposed to treat all patients with microalbuminuria, and they always had some degree of elevated blood pressure, but not very strongly. And then it became clear, even with the use of diuretics and beta blockers, that you could stop the increased rate in microalbuminuria. And the important point is that these patients with microalbuminuria and type 1 and type 2 diabetes still have very well preserved GFR. So this is before they experienced the decline in GFR. So therefore it was very logical to start in patients with microalbuminuria to treat them. And this has also become common practice and used in many guidelines, even the so-called normal blood pressure. But of course there can be some problems, especially in type 2 diabetes. There are some big trials that show that if you reduce blood pressure too much in type 2 diabetes, especially if they have complications, it may be a risk. So don't be too strict in type 2 diabetes. But in type 1, it is widely accepted. And thank you very much. And interesting enough, talking about type 1 and type 2 diabetes, when I started to do my studies, there were very few people with type 2 diabetes and end-stage renal disease. I don't really know why. And now we have the opposite situation, that most patients in the dialysis clinic are type 2 diabetic patients. And this may be because people are now living longer. They have been treated by the cardiologist and by other specialities, so they live longer. They live so long, so they develop end-stage renal disease, and they have to go to your unit and get dialysis. But at that time, in the early 60s or 70s, very few were type 2. This was mainly type 1. Maybe you have the same experience. So now, at least in Denmark, the number of patients entering end-stage renal disease units with type 1 diabetes is decreasing, while in type 1 it's increasing. So now we hope or believe that this decrease is due to better treatment. And we hope also in type 2, but in type 2 you have the problem that there are many more patients, they live longer, and there are 10 times or 15 times more patients with type 2 diabetes nowadays. Maybe it's because that since the early 60s, people are now generally more unhealthy. They eat more, they get fatter and fatter, even in Italy, even in France, where people used to be slim, but maybe not any longer. So therefore type 2 diabetes is becoming an epidemic in most countries, and even maybe worse in India and in Japan and China. So there's an epidemic of type 2 diabetes all over the world, maybe worse in the US. So even if we treat these patients better, we believe there are more and more that end up in end-stage renal disease, which is really a depressing thing. But on the other hand, it's nice that you can treat them. And I don't know about, in Denmark, many patients are treated with home dialysis. Is that the case in Italy also? Not so many, because it's very much cheaper. So you could say that what I have been involved in is describing the natural history of diabetic renal disease, starting with hyperfiltration, developing into microalbuminuria. The first abnormality is hyperfiltration, then microalbuminuria, then the increase, and then clinical proteinuria, decline in GFR, and finally end-stage renal disease. So my approach has been to explore the natural history, and by exploring the natural history and to define risk factors, you could also establish a way of treating the patients. And of course, the main background or the main reason for developing diabetic nephropathy is poor glycemic control. If you have good blood glucose control, then nobody will develop that. But unfortunately, it's not easy to normalize blood glucose. It's maybe more easy to normalize blood pressure with pills. Insulin is difficult, and there's a new thing coming up some years ago, and this was the concept of multifactorial intervention. Originally it was believed in diabetic patients you should treat the blood glucose. Although it was not proven very strictly, it became proven by the UK PDS and the DCCT. So treat blood glucose. But then it became clear that you should also treat high blood pressure. And then it became also clear by the UK prospective diabetes study and other studies that you should also treat hyperlipidemia. Because although the hyperlipidemia is not so strong in these patients, it appears that you can reduce the risk. So therefore, the group at the Steno Diabetes Center in Copenhagen, they developed the idea of multifactorial intervention. They identified patients with microalbuminuria, they are at high risk. And they treated all these patients they had at the Steno Diabetes Center with multifactorial intervention and compared them to another group that was left to go to the GPs. And it became quite clear that those who were under multifactorial intervention with best possible blood glucose control all had ACE inhibitors or ARBs or combination, and all had statins. Then you could reduce the number of patients who develop end-stage renal disease and the number of patients who died from diabetic nephropathy. So this is a very important concept, that all patients with microbiota, and this is type 2 diabetes, should be treated by this idea, by this concept of multifactorial intervention. Not only glucose, but blood pressure and dyslipidemia. And this was proven in type 2 diabetes with microbiota, and they tried to do the same in newly diagnosed type 2, but could not really document any effect. And this is probably because you had to follow these patients for many, many years before you see the results. So this is difficult to do a study. You can do a study maybe over 5 years, but to do a study over 10 or 15 years is not possible, because then the patients disappear and they start treatment on their own. So therefore, you have to select patients at high risk to show the effect in a few years' time. It's interesting because when you go to medical school, you learn that you should put up a hypothesis, you should test this hypothesis and see if it works. But in reality, this is not really feasible. Usually you have some results and then you find a problem and try to solve that problem, and there'll be a new problem that you have to solve. But to start from the beginning and do the really gold standing hypothesis that can solve everything is very difficult. So it's nice to have this idea of having an hypothesis and to see if it works or does not work. But in real life, this is not so easy. I don't know if you agree with that, but this is my experience. So I can say that I think this is a French wording. The appetite comes when you eat. Is that right? What is that in Italian or in French? The appetite comes when you eat. What is that?
L'appetito viene mangiando.
L'appétit vient en mangeant.
Yeah, and that's the same with you do studies, and then you get appetite for new studies. And it's not so you have the final idea of a study from the beginning. This is very difficult. And also when I started to do my work, it was impossible to say that I would be able to, or my idea would be I should prevent diabetic renal disease or reduce it. This would be impossible. And it would also be very ambitious and maybe over-ambitious. So the idea came when I did the studies. Well, this is difficult because now I know about the planning of many studies, and this is not easy. If you have an hypothesis and you want to do a trial, and nowadays you have to have maybe 10,000 patients to do a study. And therefore my appetite would not be so great now because, you know, there is the advanced study from Australia that should show that better glycemic control and better blood pressure control would ameliorate the complications. They needed 10,000 patients. And I would say, well, my appetite would decline. And this was the charm in the old days, that you could do a small study in your own unit and not to have to go for multi-center studies. And this is mandatory nowadays. And now maybe even if you have to do a new study, you cannot cope with 10,000. Maybe you have to 50,000 patients to do a study to prove that you can do better compared to the present state of the art. Of course, you always have to have a comparative group, and that should include the best possible treatment now, because otherwise it would be unethical. So you have the best possible treatment in one group, the control group, and then you have to introduce something new. And of course you can find some new studies. You can do a study like Dr. Parving, the direct renal inhibition and things like that, and you can do dual blockade, but usually it needs so many patients, and I think that is interesting, but my appetite is not so great. I like small studies. and in this way I was lucky, because I could do small studies, and I could do studies that was done in my own center, and not to go to other places, and not to do multi-center studies. So therefore I would say that that I would do now, I'm not sure, because maybe I would do like my daughter. My daughter has just finished medical school, and she will do general practice, because she finds that very fascinating. Because patients come into your door, into your clinic, always a new problem, always a new constellation of problems that you have to solve. And I'm not sure I will be a GP, but I find this fascinating, and I would not really like to be a member of a multi-center committee, although I have been. But so I hope you understand what my feelings are about that. But this is not, unless you get a completely new idea, and this is very difficult now, to get a new idea and to do a study in 10 patients and think if it works. This is very difficult. I don't know any risk factor or any way of treating patients where you can come along with 10 patients. Do you know any? No. So you have to do multi-center, multifactorial studies, and you know also in America they have these huge studies with 10,000 or more patients to document an effective treatment, and sometimes even you had a bad effect of the treatment. So it's not so easy. So therefore I believe that I have been lucky to start my career in a phase when you could do the studies on your own and with your group. So this is oh, I think that in our institution and my there has always been a very direct patient-doctor relationship, and also this is why it has been very easy to recruit patients for studies, because they felt that you would do something interesting and good for them. So there has been a very good relationship between physician and doctors, physician and patients. And I think this is important, because sometimes patients are suspicious about their doctors. I'm not so sure how often it is the case, but at least I know that maybe this is difficult in your country. If you prescribe tablets, only 50% of the patients take the tablets correctly. And this is disappointing, but I think this is something you find in most cases. But you have a very good relationship between physicians and patients. They may be more inclined to take the treatment that you propose to them. And this is I think this is a serious problem now, because when you have this idea of multifactorial intervention, you don't have to have 2 tablets, 3 or 4. Maybe you have to have 6 or 7 or 8 tablets a day, and who can cope with that? You have to be a doctor yourself to be able to to take all these tablets in the correct fashion. And so therefore maybe the new idea would be to create the tablet that include all the treatments that you can propose. What do we call that? This has a special term. And I think in India they have made a tablet where you can have diuretics, small dose diuretics, you can have ACE, you can have beta blockers, or maybe also ARBs and statins in one pill a day. So I think this would be a nice way for the future, but also a difficult one, because how can you document the effects, and can you find a drug company that would support a study? Unless they find they themselves make a tablet with 10 different drugs inside. So I think this would be a good idea to do that, but if it is possible, I'm not sure. Well, I think some of the very bright moments was when you realized that the treatment you proposed in fact worked. If you had done follow-up studies and then you saw that your treatment strategy in fact worked, because for many years there's uncertainty, does this work or does it not work? And then if you realize this is sufficient, you can reduce rate of decline in GFR, you can reduce microbiota, you can find new ways of reducing blood pressure. Then when you realize that, this is a great moment. And I think all physicians hope to experience these moments. With some individual patients, I'm not completely sure, but I must say that I have, of course, been treating many patients, and I feel that there's always been a very tight relationship between the patient and myself, so therefore the patient more or less would believe in what I was saying and would stick to the treatment. And of course, if you do studies with few patients, and if one patient do not take the prescribed drugs, the study is hopeless. So you have to believe in your patients in that way if you do small studies. So, and of course you can't control everything, and you can't. Of course now you can make control, you can count tablets, you can put radioactive substances in the tablets and things like that. But I never did that. So, so therefore I believe that now maybe I would not start to be a physician today, because it would be too difficult. And maybe I would, if I were a physician, I don't know, maybe I would be a nephrologist, because there you can really see that you treat the patients with dialysis and they improve from one day to the next day. And the problem in many types of treatment that you prescribe, you cannot see the immediate results. It takes years and years and years. So therefore, it's of course nice to see results. So therefore, some people want to be surgeons. They can take away the appendix and the patient walk away. But this is maybe too simple. So therefore, it's not easy to decide what I would do today if I was ending medical school tomorrow. Well, she didn't start to study medicine from the beginning. She started a kind of sociology, but she felt there was no real progress. So then she started to study medicine, and she was always happy about that. But my other children, there's one who is art historian, another one is a literature specialist, and our boy is an engineer who is employed, of course, by the medical industry. Oh, I like many things. But I had a keen interest in art collecting and to study art. And maybe I would be a student or an art historian if I should start now, because this is very exciting. And what I really like to do is to see also in art, who is the first to develop a topic, and see how this topic is taken over by other people. Just like in medicine, who find out first about an important topic, and to see all the people who follows. The same you can do in art history, who is the first to use a specific topic and see how it develops, and that is quite interesting. Another thing that I'm interested in is when I travel, I always try to collect typical artwork from the area where I stay. And here in Prague it's not difficult, because there are many important artists, and I have also a keen interest in graphic art, because you cannot buy paintings, even if you are a famous physician. You cannot afford too many paintings. But here in Prague, many years ago, when I went here first time, I saw some very beautiful graphic work by a female artist called Emilie Tanovera. And when I came here again, I find also some work by her. Very nice. Tumanova is her name. And this is what I like when I travel, to find something that is typical for the art in the area, and also that depicts, for instance, the city, because this artist make very beautiful graphic of the city of Prague. There are so many beautiful places that you can depict here. So I like to select studies that paintings or graphic work that is maybe of architectural nature, the architecture of the city, and also there are many Danish artists, maybe also in France. The Danish artists in the 19th century, they all went to Italy to paint there, and and also many famous Danish artists, and we call it the golden age of the Danish painting. They all go to Italy and paint Forum Romanum and a lot of places in Italy. So you can't really now they are museum pieces, so this is something you cannot collect. But you can collect maybe artists that is just after this golden era, and there are some that I like very much who travel to Italy, and in fact they travel to many places, Egypt and Spain, and they like to depict what they see, the beautiful things they see, the architecture or the pyramids. So I think this is fascinating to collect and to study what we call traveling artists. And they all went to Italy. Many went to Italy. Maybe not Torino so many. And some went to France, but not so many. France was not so popular for, although many went to Paris. But this is something different. The Grand Tour, yes. This is, you can say the Grand Tour is part of that concept. And another thing that is related to the Grand Tour is the British. They went to Italy, and on the Grand Tour they went to Italy, and what they often bought in Italy was not so much painting, but maybe graphic. And you know the famous Piranesi. Piranesi was bought a lot by the British. They took his graphic back to England, and sometimes you can buy it in England at a cheaper rate than in Italy. So I have a lot of Pioneses at home that I bought many years ago because I became fascinated with these prints. I don't know if he did not work in Torino. He worked in the southern part of Italy, and he was a fantastic.
He lived for a long time in Rome.
Yeah, and he depicted Rome, but he also went to southern Italy, also to Pestum and others.
The rediscovery of
And therefore I became very much fascinated by Piranesi. The first time I went to Florence, where I found some graphics there that I was happy to buy. So I think this is interesting, although it has nothing to do with medicine. I think that many physicians are also interested in art. That's my experience. But if you can treat people with art, if you ask that, no. But how it goes together? Well, I think I can come back to this idea. Who are doing making the first approach, for instance, in painting to a special topic, and you can do the same in medicine. You can discover a new topic and develop that topic. That's something that is maybe in common. So you can say the origin and development of ideas is common for medicine and art history. Origin and development of ideas. I think I wrote a review article with that title. Origin and development of ideas was a paper I wrote, a review paper after a talk I made some years ago. And you can always, it's interesting when you do studies. Quite often you think you were the first who did the study or who discovered a topic. For instance, I thought we were the first to discover the renal hypertrophy in diabetes. But interestingly, this was found by Claude Bernard 150 years ago. And you see, he only had one patient. He did an autopsy on a patient with diabetes who had huge kidneys. And he describes that in a small paper, Claude Bernard. But of course, Claude Bernard is a great hero in medicine, not only in France, I'm sure. So quite often you are disappointed. You think you're the first to make that discovery, but then you see Claude Bernard, he did the same. Yeah. And then it's of course a nice company to be with Claude Bernard or Richiero or whoever. Poetry. Well, not so much poetry, but I like novels. And of course here in the Czech Republic you have important people like Kundera, and you have Ivan Klima, and you have many other important authors. And this is interesting because this was in fact created by the very nature of the nation. They had this problem with foreign invaders. So maybe now, when everything is more peaceful, it's not so easy to write novels. You cannot write novels about happy people. You can write novels about unhappy people or difficult situations. So poetry, I have of course some Danish poets who are very famous, and they usually they usually go to Paris to get inspired. There's a very famous, but you see these poets, Danish, are only famous in Denmark. There's a very famous poet called Sophus Clausen, who went to Paris and had a lot of inspiration by being in Paris, and especially the female part of Paris. So he writes great poesy, but otherwise I'm more inclined to read novels.